we're going to, well, I am going to pose a few questions to the artist. We're going to conduct this segment as an open forum, and then we're going to open up the floor so that you can pose questions I know that are burning inside because the work is so intriguing. So basically, we're going to address themes that run throughout both exhibitions, and that is perceptions of Africa, the issue of identity, and the roles that the Africans played in Renaissance society. And that is roles not only as slaves, but roles which enriched the European culture through wealth, their economic wealth that was gained by the Africans, and also the culture that was enriched by the presence of the Africans. So we're going to open the discussion talking about the perceptions of Africa and Africans and the stereotyping based on appearance and behavior, skin color, and also back to the flawed reports by Europeans who in many cases did not visit Africa, but created documents and writings that stereotyped them based on these misbeliefs or misconceptions that they had. So, does anyone want to respond, or should I call on someone first?
I'll say
All right, great. We love a volunteer.
No, I have these obscure facts in my head from reading to make these paintings, but I mean, one thing that I didn't know, and I think I shared this with you on our car ride to DC that day, was that Africans were, I had no idea they were slaves, yes, but they were also doing things like teaching swimming, they were teaching drum lessons, like all these random occupations that they had within the European community that are just never stated. Like the stories, just those kinds of stories just aren't told. Like, you know, a swim instructor, I wouldn't think, or diving, or, you know, dancing and things like that. And then I thought it was interesting. I got this book from I got this. Oh, there's one book out there that's like the Bible, but it's called Black Africans in the European Renaissance, and they take you from one chapter, stereotypes, to, you know, in Black and Spanish literature, yada yada. But one interesting thing that I also remembered was the experience of the Africans in Portugal and how conservative the Portuguese were. And so it was kind of the beginning of, I guess, the building of stereotypes, because Africans were just in Portugal being African, which meant they were dancing, they were laughing, they were smiling and all these things. And the Portuguese are very conservative people, so they found their behavior to be offensive when they were just being themselves. And it you know, it mirrors, I think, the Black experience in America. I mean, they were calling them lazy and all these things, and it's like, why can't they stop dancing? Why don't they stop making music? Why are they laughing so much? Because everything that the Portuguese did was very, you know, very conservative. So I thought that was interesting because it was like a comedy of errors. No matter what they did, it wasn't the right thing, and it was just exacerbating the situation of them being called savages and being treated differently and being treated like, you know, like they weren't human. So.
I want to jump on. Amy, that was great. I liked your research. I want to jump into kind of all the artists. Some of you guys made work that was created before this exhibition even started, and I think what's really cool is that there are these commonalities taking place, that the Africans, the descendants, are still dancing and still thinking about where they are and what they're doing here, and still kind of feeling displaced. And I think, jumping on what you brought up, it's a really interesting thing because it's so much in our heart, no matter what we make, whether it be in response specifically to this exhibition or just what comes out of us.
My response to your question, which is just, one of the things that really engaged me with this work, Ethiopia, was that there's a whole lot of experience of, you know, being Black and assumptions that people have about me and of, you know, Black people. So some of the questions I was asking myself, and observation, was that most of the times Africans or their descendants, whether in Africa or elsewhere, are not attributed with intellect. And through reading the history of the, some of the Africans, even though most of them, even though they were diplomats and so on, and who ruled their own societies successfully, most of them were taken there as slaves, and they also contributed intellectually to even the Renaissance period.
Okay, I wanted to talk about the stereotypes that were reinforced verbally, textually, and visually. And that was through imagery and writing and illustration. Now you as a contemporary artist have started a new chapter and expressing your voice in the roles of Africans. Your works are now an archive, part of that language and narrative. The Renaissance works, for the most part, I believe, with the probably exception of one or two, were created by white Europeans. Now we have the African and the African-American voice speaking to the contemporary issues and addressing the vestiges of the roles that the Africans played. So how, in another century or two, would you like to have your work thought about and looked upon? I mean, you've responded to the work of the Renaissance artists. How, in the future, would you like for your work to be thought about in terms of the exhibition today?
Well, I think the key is that we're finally getting to speak for ourselves, and people respect and honor and appreciate that. It's a beautiful thing to be free in what you create, and that there's a plethora of ideas out there. It's not just one straight thought by one type of person. And I think that's the key. In the future, we're going to look back at a greater viewpoint. But it's still so small, and there's a lot more that needs to be done, I believe. But I think that's why we're here, and that's one of the reasons why I'm an artist.
I think I would like to, well, I find myself, I guess, in a place of conundrum, because I was thinking, when Victor said, when he was talking about Barack Obama and how he can be the most powerful person in the world, but he's black, so he's still not legitimized. So I have that floating here. And then I have, then we have these conversations that we have here about slavery and about race. And then I have my own micro-narrative of a life that exists somewhere inside of that's the trajectory for my work, which I try to pursue. I call myself an escape artist or a deconstructionist. I haven't quite yet figured out how to say what it is I want to say, but what I want, I guess for me, what I want my work to represent is the beginning of a new narrative. And not that I want to lose the old one, because it's hard to, when you have a black president that's not legitimized, because you feel like you still need to present some sort of fight, and it's, blackness is still reactionary, but I want to present a narrative of like the freedom to dream of something else, like another way of existing, another way of being, and let blackness be a trope of possibilities versus like you're stuck. I was born black, I was born in Georgia, I was born a Christian, and if I can deconstruct God in my religion and find myself in a place of spiritual but not religious, then I can also do the same with this construct of race, while respecting that there's still people that are still struggling within that paradigm, and so I think just a narrative of like of freedom to just be something besides I mean, black is such a heavy word. It's just like black, and it changes everything. Too many black people, it changes the party. A gallery can't have too many black artists, or it's a black gallery. I'm like, it's just, you know, it's so much that comes along with it. I don't know any other ethnicity that has, you know, I took a class at Johns Hopkins on the production of black visual culture. I mean, it's like we talk and think about it, it's so complex. But at some point we have to simplify it, and I don't have the solution. But, and so it's a personal journey at this point, and, you know, and these are kind of like my notes in my diary, kind of the paintings, but hopefully just to find a place of peaceful existence and let the, and not always viewing myself through how I think other people look at me, because I still struggle with that too. Being, you know, raised in Georgia, in this little small town where, you know, it's still kind of racist. So, just a place of freedom, I guess.
For me, it's about being just a part of the great American narrative. And what I mean by that is me being a descendant from African slaves and African Moors, mother, adult fiend, daddy, adult fiend. I mean, if that's not American, I don't know what is. I mean, it's part of the American story, and I want my story, my family stories, to be in the American art history book. I mean, yeah, you know, I think our stuff is separate. Okay, we can't, you know, get away from that to some degree. But when you're, you know, reading about Andy Warhol, I want to be a part of that narrative, and the Southern Black narrative, you know, of the experience of growing up in the South and the prejudice, and even this sort of struggle with our identity is just an American story. Yep.
For me, I would like for my work to, in 100 years from now, well, hopefully we'll be unicolored by then. So that's one thing. It'll just be like some more stories to hear about the past, and hopefully my paintings will have questions that some people will have answers to. But I just want to make one comment that I kind of disagree with Amy and Victor about, and that's the validity, I think was the word, of Obama. I think it depends on who you're listening to. I think he's extremely legitimized, that was the word, and I believe most of the world sees him as a very powerful figure and a very respected figure, except for a few here in America. I think he's pretty legitimized. Everywhere I've been since he's been president, I mean, yeah. I think that blackness in general is what we all know is the most copied of anything. It's always been that way. It probably always will be that way. So, and that's why I feel Obama is legitimized, because, I mean, you have figures that are nowhere near where he is, like Jay-Z and all these other characters that are known and admired around the world, and everyone is trying to be like them. And then they really aren't thinking about being black. They just think it's cool, which that's what it is. So.
Talking about how I would like to be remembered. Well, I usually don't think so much about that, but I just believe that I just do my work and try to put it out as much as I can, and that is my story. And I believe that the more we all tell our stories, the more it gets out there. And those who will listen, and we need to continue to do what we do, because it's in our work that we correct some of the misconceptions. It's in our telling our stories that we show that we are present to tell, to correct some of these misconceptions. And then if anybody wants to hear the story, will ask me about it rather than make up something that to represent me when I'm alive. So, which is why, I didn't do this consciously, but when I left college, I was studying what it is I wanted to do with my art, and I really started investigating the traditional art forms in Africa, and I was really fascinated by the writing systems because even my history books in Africa also told us that there was no writing. So, but my grandfathers knew they could write. They just didn't call it, alphabets like the Europeans did. But they still practice it today, and that's how I thought I could bring this into a contemporary visual language that I think so far, wherever I begin to talk about this has become a subject of discussion. And I see a lot of Adinkra symbols flying around here in African diaspora communities, and that is also part of telling our stories about our literacy. And there's a very good exhibition going on now at the National Museum for African Art called the African Cosmos, that also says that cosmology is not something you got from, a science that you got from Europe. Africans had that science as well. And so that's how the story gets out, and that's how we should continue to do it. About legitimacy of Barack Obama, well, that's just, it's one thing to mimic the culture and want to be that. It's another thing to actually, like you said, you went to Europe and you saw most of the people, most of the blacks there were cleaners. But that is the image of the African in Europe. Obama is an anomaly. The Obama story is an anomaly. The story of the African in Europe and everywhere are the street cleaners and not the intellectuals. And that didn't start, it started with that man challenging his co-playwright, who was challenging his legitimacy, even though he was, they were equals, but he was still challenging his legitimacy because his mother wasn't white. His mother was a slave and was in the lower class. So how dare you? And the man, you gave him that statement, and it's still going on today. You have to stand up and prove yourself 100 times or every time that you are as bright as anybody else. And that is what I'm talking about.
Thank you. We're going to open up the floor, but we need to say goodbye to Maya. Maya has to leave. She has a little one she has to care for. But thank you, Maya, for joining us, and thank you for being part of this.
My name is Teresa Fleming. I am an American art curator at the Smithsonian AfricanAmerican Museum. Since 2015. And one of the interesting things I've been thinking about in terms of African Americans and contemporary art, in particular younger artists, is the expectation by the mainstream American museums and galleries that black artists always do art that reflects blackness. And one of the things that's interesting about this Renaissance exhibition is what Myrtis talked about, that the vast majority of the artists who are depicting blacks are not of African descent. And my question is, because I'm looking at it from the curator's perspective, but I'd be interested, particularly in the young artist perspective of, I know that most artists want to reflect their identity, their experience, but we also are Americans. And I think that African Americans aren't necessarily given the freedom to do other types of art that are not reflective of blackness, even though you might be interested in other things other than blackness. But if a gallery wants to purchase you, a museum, they want to make sure that everyone knows that this is their black artist, so they know they're diverse. And many abstractionists have had the problem over the years of being accepted because their work doesn't directly reflect blackness. And I think this problem seems to be getting worse and not better. And I was wondering if any artists on the panel would like to discuss this sort of expectation that everything we do deals with black identity.
I had this discussion with myself when I started this body of work a few years ago, because I almost, I don't know whether obligated is the word, but I studied with this artist in Norway named Oddner, and I was the only black artist there. He's a world-renowned painter. He's painting himself for like millions of dollars, and you know, his favorite artist is Rembrandt. We talk about the old masters and things, and he asked a question one time. We were sitting by a fireplace, and he said, "What painting would you like to look at? Like the last painting that you want to see before you die?" And everyone else was saying, like, "I want to see Velázquez. I want to see, you know, all these other old masters." And I said, "I want to see my own work." And so I think it was at that moment I decided, I was like, I mean, especially portraiture for me, there is no, who's going to make it if I don't? So at this point, I don't feel like maybe we're far enough ahead that I can stop. Because yeah, I want to make stuff. I want to make like a solar panel piece in the desert that grows organic. You know, like I want to do, I think and read about other stuff. And the way I approached it in my work was that I decided that, you know, I would try to create these fantasy archetypes. Like that would kind of give me the freedom that I want without feeding into what I see as a brand of art, of blackness that's given a platform across the board, kind of. I think, I don't know where everybody knows who Hennessy Youngman is, but he talks about what it takes to the video is called How to Be a Good Black Artist, and one of them is paint black people doing things that white people do, make work that's angry. I mean, he's being facetious when he's saying it, but it's kind of true. And so after seeing the Carol Walker exhibition at the Whitney Museum several years ago, and you know, seeing like the violent puppet show and like all this stuff, and we're around the same age, and we're, you know, both from Georgia, I was like, I really don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to process it into my life, because my, you know, like I said, my micro narrative is not this, so that's there. And if I have to make work about the black experience, how can I create a different discourse? But you know, I do feel like I have to do it, kind of, and it's not a bad thing. I just, if I open up a history book and don't see myself, then at this point, is it my fault? You know, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether that's a good answer or not, but.
Well, I was listening to a podcast from Alice Walker a couple of months ago, and she was talking about when she wrote The Color Purple, how the black community was upset with her, and they were saying, you know, how could you air out our dirty business? And you know, she was saying that this isn't a black woman's story. This is a woman's story. This is a Chinese woman's story. This is African woman's story. So with that being said, my work isn't necessarily about the black experience. Again, you know, me just being raised by, you know, people who were in this lifestyle of drugs, and these women that were sort of overlooked, again, is not just a black woman's story, you know? I mean, those sort of narratives reflect throughout the world. And so, with that being said, I had a curator a few months ago, and she was like, oh, you know, if you want to be in the museums, stop making, you know, black narratives. You know, you want to think beyond that. And I was thinking, like, it's not a black narrative. It's just a story. Why does it have to be about blackness? I mean, granted, I am black, but you know, with Sherald, or you know, it was just work about whiteness. You know, so it's something that we sort of we struggle with, and I also recognize that, you know, not necessarily in this space, but as my career, as I move forward in my career, that, you know, I wear that moniker as a black female artist. And as frustrating as it is at times, you know, there is a sense of pride. So it's sort of, it's a struggle. It's just a struggle.
Yeah. Ouch. That's an interesting comment or question that you brought up about having to be black. I believe or feeling that you represent blackness in your work. Because for me, when I first started painting, that was the one thing I wanted to avoid. I'm a self-taught painter, and in my practice as a self-taught painter, I went all the way in. And when I say all the way in, when I would walk around in my young part of my career, I would have paint all over me. And people would see me and like, oh, you do art, you do black art. And for me, that was a profound part in my life because I'm a black person, so I do black art. But for my art, especially when I first started painting, because as I mentioned before, that wasn't what I was trying to do. I was trying to create artwork for a space that was contemporary. So I wanted contemporary artwork in my space. So my original intention for even creating art was to create, that was it, to create temporary work, contemporary work. It had nothing to do with race or combing hair or going to church or any of those things. And I tried for many years to stay away from doing things like that because I didn't want to be put into that mold of a black artist that does black art. I'm one of those that believes I'm an American, first of all. I really only associate with African American because that's what my label is among society, but I consider myself an American. Like I said, when I leave America, I'm not considered an African American, I'm considered an American. On my passport, it says American. African is nowhere on my passport. So my work here in this exhibition is specific to the exhibition. And another set of paintings that I'm working on now are specific to an African American, quote unquote, experience. And that's the only time that my work really kind of represents. It has to be something profound that affects not only me, but affects a lot of other people that makes me want to even want to paint something usually. So I've never felt that I had to paint black themes to be an artist. I've been very fortunate that my work has sold, and it's very rare that it usually has anything to do with race at all. It usually has to do with other subjects other than race.
I guess that's the other African in this panel.
That's true. We're the only African American in the room.
Yeah, well, I'm African American now. Well, the way I see it, all artists, there's no artist that is an island unto themselves. All artists, we all have to bring our creativity from the point of where, what is familiar to us and what we know. And that's probably the best way you could be true to what you do. It's not trying to be somebody else. So I really don't see any problem with being an African American artist or painting African American themes, if there is any such thing. It's just that is your experience, and that's the only way you could be true to it. And do it convincingly until you've exhausted that experience. Whether it's figuration or you want to express it in the abstract, it is your experience. And artists who try to push to not be or not do their own, be true to themselves, it's always very clear that they're pretending. And that said, I did, like I said, when I was, I studied fine art at the University of Ife in Nigeria, and I used to make portraiture to earn a living when I was in college. I used to work as an illustrator, a literary illustrator for a newspaper. I illustrated children's books. So figuration is very much a skill that I have. But I personally wasn't feeling that there was much there for me personally in terms of artistic exploration. There was, the African artistic genre is really vast, and you could see it in a lot of, not just the mask, in the decorations. I'm looking at Kuba cloth right here, and you're seeing a lot of abstract patterns on this. So there's no one thing about saying this is African, this is not. It's very vast, and I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore how I could tap into this rich history of abstraction and stylization and so on. And how do I bring that into my work, which is why sometimes my work ends up the way it is, as abstract and sometimes semi-abstract. And I remember coming when the first time I showed my work here in the United States, and I showed it to a fellow black person, and she said, "Well, you're not making black art." And I said, "What is black art?" And he said, "Well, your work is so abstract." I said, "Well, abstraction has always been in my culture. It's always been there. How much of the African, art from Africa do you know about?" I said, "Well, not really." So it's all where we come from.
Thank you. We're going to try to have a couple more questions, so you guys shorten your answers just a little bit so we can get a little bit more questions in.
Well, I think mine is less of a question, more of a comment. When I came here first and saw this exhibit and then went to the Walters and saw the exhibit, something stuck out for me, and it stays in my mind, and I can't wait to get my catalog, because it says something new is always coming out of Africa. And I want to say thank you to Myrtis and to all of you, because one of the reasons I have started to collect African art is because something new is always coming out of the AfricanAmerican, African diaspora artists that speaks to me. I've always had things on my wall, but now I don't care what you call it, I have my art on my wall. And I just want to say to all of you, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment and a quick question. The quick comment is Jimi Hendrix said that he was a guitarist. He didn't say he was a black guitarist. Just music, art, it's all there. We are right. But the question I have goes to the term African, which the continent that we call Africa was called Ethiopia until the Roman Empire and Africanus, who was a general in the Roman army, defeated Hannibal and named the continent Africa. The corollary to that, however, is that at the height of the Roman Empire, over 80% of the citizens of Rome were of Ethiopian descent. The question is this: when a person depicts what they are surrounded by, because that is of their experience, is it fair to call it anything other than the art of their experience? I've never noticed anything called white art. Never heard the term used. Yeah, there's cultural art, there's Chinese art, these are things that are based on an actual locality, geographic locality. We are a diaspora. We are part of many localities. We, to call something as black art, it used to mean witchcraft. So anyway, I just want to get a reaction from you all about that concept of who we are when we are artists as opposed to who we are when we're not. Are we still black?
Well, I guess it depends on who is doing the naming.
Yes.
Right, and whether the person who's doing the naming has the loudest megaphone. And then it becomes the norm for everybody.
Because we don't call impressionists.
My grandfather did not know, he never called himself African, or my great-grandfather never called himself Nigerian either. But in today's world, that's what we are. That's what we call ourselves. He called himself Ibibio, because that was his ethnicity.
I was abducted by earthlings at an early age.
Well, just to respond to the question or the comment about the labeling of art and categorizing it, maybe the curators may want to speak to this as well. You know, we don't use the term white art, we use the term impressionists. And we don't say white art, but we say pop art. And so there are ways in which, you know, the art world, I find, is the most segregated industry in existence. As Jamea said, you know, it's black, and don't create work that represents your blackness or your black experience, because you'll be marginalized, separated, segregated. And so we look at the Renaissance paintings and we see that the same theories, philosophy, psyche, psychosis existed then, and it still exists now. And so that's again why this work is so relevant, because what we think is in our past keeps showing itself as being part of our future and our present. And so that's why, again, these brilliant works, and I ask about how you would like for your work to be reflected on in, you know, in the future. Because you are creating works that will live beyond your lifetime. And you are, as someone said, you know, these are autobiographical works, they're historical works, and we're hoping that they'll, you know, end up in someone's collection or museum so that they can be studied and reflected upon in the same way that the Renaissance works are now. Many of those pieces came from private collections, by the way. So, any other questions?
I'd like to make a comment on what the brother just mentioned about what are you when you're not. And I think it's important for people to realize that about artists is that it's not an occupation. This is not an occupation. It is a career, but it's more of a lifestyle, at least for me. I mean, I've embedded myself in a lifestyle of being an artist. And what that means to me is I'm always working for the most part. It's just, there's always something motivating me or inspiring me in some sort of way that's going to get me to make stuff. And I'm into the act of making things. And so that's a 24/7 job for me. And I'm sure it is for all of us up here.
All right, well, I'd just like to say a couple things in closing. One, again, to thank you for supporting the exhibition and these artists. Dr. Spicer, who is the curator for the Walters, will be speaking here on the 11th, and we hope that you will come back and join us. She will share with you her perspective on the exhibition that's featured at the Walters, tying in these two exhibitions. And she has some really interesting insight and information she would like to share about the 15-year struggle she has had with bringing that exhibition to the Walters. There was a lot of resistance and pushback against,
spoke a little bit last week.
yes, against her bringing it there. And one of the reasons, because the historians continue to remind her that there was not evidence of certain roles that the African played in the European society, neglecting to realize that the portraits were doing just that. So where there was a white image of someone of high society, high social status, that became an archive of their existence. But where there was a portrait of an African, somehow that was questionable and suspect. So she has a really, it's going to be a very dynamic discussion, and I hope that you will come back and support us. It's an eye-opening experience that you'll have when you return.